Dot and cross product nodes in vector math. Let's take just a quick look at dot first. There is, of course, in my YouTube the spot info dot product tutorial, which basically covers everything that dot product does, or at least gives you some more examples of it. But just to repeat the basics, the dot product will return the cosine of the angle between two vectors. So, takes two input vectors, finds the angle between them, and remaps that angular value, essentially, into a 0 to 1 value via cosine. So I've got two nulls here, which each represent a vector. This represents 0, 1, 0 for y. This represents 0, 0, 1 for z. The angle between them is obviously 90 degrees. So I'm going to take the position of each of these nulls via item info there. So I've got my two input vectors. So this is now outputting the cosine of 90 degrees, which is of course 0. Cosine 90 is 0. 0 degrees is cosine 1. See if I bring this null up here, so we're not quite at 90 degrees anymore, we're more like 45. Boom, there's my cosine value. If we want to go back to an angular value, of course, all we have to do is throw in an arc cos node, or inverse cosine. This is now the angle, as we can see here, 1.57, that's 90 degrees expressed in radians, remember. So if I take a make vector, I pop it into y, for pitch, and I pop that into rotation. This node motion is on the bone, by the way. Bingo! We can see that our bone has jumped to 90 degrees of rotation. Why is it not between these two vectors, taking the midpoint? Because the value that we're outputting isn't a vector direction between them. It is the angle that exists between the two vectors, and that angle is 90 degrees, and since I've pumped that into my rotation input, my bone has rotated to 90 degrees. So that's what dot does. Now let's take a look at cross, and this is the main reason I've put the little bone in the scene here. The cross product of any two vectors is a third vector that is at 90 degrees to both. If we just take a look at the regular handles that we've got in Lightwave, if you take for instance the x-axis and the z-axis, okay, the y-axis is at 90 degrees to them both. See? 90 degrees to the z and 90 degrees to the x. Any of these three axes can be thought of as the cross product of the other two. Of course, any two vectors define a plane. Yep, you can always draw a flat plane across two vectors, a flat grid if you will. So you can also think of cross product as orienting things at 90 degrees to that plane. And that's probably the most common way that you'll tend to use it in 3D for doing stuff. So for instance, I've got my two nulls here. Okay, this is why I've got the lines drawn on them. Okay, so these two nulls are drawing lines between themselves and the origin point here. So we can see they're effectively making a triangle, right? A pseudo polygon, let's call it, that's being defined by the null vectors here, the null positions. So I'm going to take nulls 1 and 2, get their cross product, and this vector then should be at 90 degrees to this triangle plane. Okay, if I pump it straight into rotation, we'll notice that our bone goes off in a not 90 degrees angle. Reason why, of course, because this is taking a heading pitch bank input, so what I really want here is something that we've seen elsewhere, a matrix HPB node, because what this cross product is creating is effectively a virtual null that would be out here at 1, 0, 0. 1 on the x, 0 on the y, 0 on the z. Which as far as our bone is concerned needs to be its forward, if we want to point it that way. So I plug the result into forward, heading pitch bank into rotation, and bingo, we see that our bone is now aligned 90 degrees to this virtual plane. And we can see that as I move these two nulls around and alter where this plane's shape is, at any point we line up with our plane, we can see that the bone is always pointed at 90 degrees to it. And that is what cross product gives you, essentially. Much like taking one vector as an up, another vector as a right, this will produce the forward. Or one vector as a right, one vector as a forward, this will produce the up. And there you have it, the dot and cross product nodes.